So welcome back, everyone. And so our next speaker is Bill Geyer, the RG Pilot helicopter maintainer. So welcome, Bill, and over to you for your traditional helicopter update.
All right, thank you. And I'm here tonight just to provide some update on what's been happening with the traditional helicopter code over the past year. Here's my outline. So I'll start off with some changes that have happened since I've talked last, and then I'll get to talking about some current projects. Some of them are mine, some of them are some other folks that have been working on some traditional helicopter code stuff, and then talk about what we're doing, what we're planning for in the future. Okay, so we'll start off with the changes since last year, and the big one that came around, one of the big ones was this airspeed sensor support. Big thanks to Josh Henderson for taking on that, tackling that with some of the other developers to get that support in there. I think it's been long awaited, at least on my side, just because I've always had an interest to get airspeed into helicopters, and overall it just provides a better ability to, once we get into being able to use it in navigation, at least allow us to at least fly at airspeed, on airspeed, so that you can actually use it for like performance and flying at best range speed or your best endurance. So that would help out a lot. So, but for now, it's going into 4.2 with just display and logging purposes. So that'll be great. Autonomous takeoff fixes that we've had. So back, I guess in 4.0, guided mode takeoff got broken, and there's a couple other things with autonomous takeoff, essentially that were limited, and a lot of that stuff has been now, guided mode takeoff was fixed in 4.1, and there's a few other things that when we fixed guided mode takeoff, we've enabled some other features. One of them is basically the ability to take off, essentially spool up, do the takeoff, do a full mission, and land all autonomously. So things like being able to arm in auto mode. I think the feature that went in where you are now able to program in the mission command an aux function. So now you can do your motor interlock and set that, enable it, and disable it through that command. So that allows pretty full functional, like I said, from spool up to shut down, being able to do it fully autonomous with the helicopters now. And the last one was this being able to land during an autonomous mission and then subsequently take off. And that is also possible now with 4.1. So some good fixes there, and good changes that really make helicopter a lot more useful in autonomous flight. So the other things that's changed since last year is the collective setup, and that's actually going to be in 4.2 that's coming up. And kind of a little bit of a history of this. In 3.5 and earlier, we had this parameter called land collective min, and essentially it was used, essentially it restricted the auto collective modes from being able to, like alt hold, I guess I would say, basically restricted the autopilot from being able to lower the collective below a certain point. So if you had like really large negative collective programmed into your helicopter, it didn't let it do that while it was on the ground. It also was used to be able to determine landing detection. That, along with a few other criteria, basically said, hey, if I go below this collective value, then and all these other features are, all this other logic is satisfied, then I'm landed. Well, those rarely used, this parameters were rarely used by our users. Many did not know how to use it. And we had in 3.6 had basically lumped it into the H collective mid, thinking that the H collective mid meaning that it's set at 0 thrust, would be good enough to capture that feature of being able to determine when you're landed, because 0 thrust would be a case where you should be descending quite quickly. But what we found is that that wasn't a really good indicator, and it really didn't work for all helicopter setups. So in 4.2, I took it upon myself to kind of come up with a better way to do this and make it more robust for user setups. And so I got rid of the H collective mid, and I went and defined or added 4 parameters, 2 of which kind of go with the H collective max and H collective min parameters. So H collective max and min are basically the parameters that define the maximum PWM and minimum PWM value for your collective settings. And so those, along with H collective max degrees and H collective min degrees. So now we're bringing kind of more the realism into the autopilot, kind of giving it actual values that it can associate with those PWM. And so now it lets the autopilot make smarter decisions about where the defaults should be for the 0 collective and the H collective land min. So notice I brought that back. So I brought back the H collective land min, slightly differently named, but both it and collective 0 thrust are both based on collective in degrees, not in PWM like it was before. So that really makes it a lot easier to set defaults and kind of not have to worry about when a user goes and sets up the helicopter that their 0 thrust and their H collective land min values are not going to be at least good enough for basic flight. So it's going to make it a lot simpler for the setup and kind of keep it kind of fire and forget for those parameters unless they have some special situation. So I think that's going to be a big improvement. It's also in so last year, I think I talked about this last year, that I implemented a new dynamics model for in the CITL for the conventional helicopter in CITL. It was based on my helicopter, and I've gone out and done some SysID on the on just a pitch and roll axes for the rotor. So basically got the rotor dynamics and pitch and roll. Well, I guess I was at a conference and saw a briefing on this Blade 360 helicopter. They had this paper here. I viewed and saw that they had totally identified a Blade 360 helicopter, and realized that I misinterpreted what the second bump here is on the roll axis. It wasn't a lead lag mode. That was actually one of the flap regressive modes, and was very important. And I kind of noticed that I wasn't getting similar results in the tuning of my auto tune when I was working with it last year. And so seeing this paper and realizing that this was actually a flap regressive mode helped once I improved the dynamics model for the conventional helicopter, helped me a lot in getting auto tune to actually work and actually be able to compare well with the results I was seeing in flight. And then I also added the Blade 360. I talked to the author, was able to get his data and be able to then add that model into CITL. So I had yet another model that I could use and run the auto tune against to get, and it was quite a different, Blade 360 is a much smaller helicopter than probably a 2.5, well, actually smaller than that, 18-inch rotor diameter, whereas I was running my helicopters as a 600, so it had more of a 27-inch rotor diameter, 2 foot. So big improvement there to help with trying to use auto tune and basically develop auto tune. I spoke about this last year, this improved rotor speed governor, and I was remiss in trying to get this in real quick because obviously I was in the throes of trying to develop auto-tune. So when I kind of got to the point where I was pretty satisfied with how auto-tune was going last fall, I turned my sights on for a little bit of time. This improved the rotor speed governor and was able to get that implemented. Chris Olson, one of the previous Heli maintainers that was with me for a while there, he had developed this. He had it running in a version of ArduPilot that was being used by some clients of his, and has a lot of time on it. Kind of the new thing to this rotor speed governor was that it was able to adjust for temperature changes or condition changes that the motor may be experiencing, and so that requires kind of a change. It would have required a change in the throttle curve, but this governor has the ability to adjust its reference in order to adjust for those changes in conditions that cause differences in the throttle or the power that the engine's producing. So I think there's a great addition, and was able to get it in this past fall, and it's available in 4.2 for our users. All right, so I'm going to talk about auto-tune now, but I wanted to just there's a lot of terminology I'm going to be using. Maybe not all of you are familiar with this terminology, especially talking about frequency domain. So let's just spend a second talking about what these terms mean, and that way hopefully clear as we go through the brief. So in moving from time domain to frequency domain, we're going to be talking about an oscillation. What are some of the characteristics that you generally want to be paying attention to kind of to characterize the signal? So we can see that we have this this input signal here, this red input signal. We have the blue, which is the got it wrong. So I think it should be backwards. Sorry, blue is the output, red is the input. When I labeled this earlier today, I got it wrong. So red is the input, blue is our output, and so you can see that they're both at the same. There's a little bit of a transient initially, but they're both at the same frequency essentially, except you see that the output is slightly out of phase with the input. So there's a couple things we talk about when we're talking about going into the frequency domain. One is, first of all, the frequency, which we define as this, we can look at the peaks, and we can take that time between the peaks and turn that into what is the frequency based on that. Next, we look at the amplitude ratio. So we want to look at what is the amplitude of the input signal, peak to trough, and then we want to look at the amplitude of the output signal, peak to trough. And then so the output over the input, or divided by the input, is what we call our amplitude ratio. And we can talk about, talk a little bit more about amplitude ratio. That's essentially what we're going to define as the gain of the response, frequency response. And then the other thing we're going to talk about a lot is the phase of the frequency response. And so the phase is defined by this time between the peak of the input and the peak of the output. And so in our case, that's mainly the peak of the output is going to it's going to occur later than the peak of the input. So we're going to say that the response lags the input by a certain amount. But in any case, we can define that as a phase in degrees by taking that time and adjusting it, putting it through this calculation. It's basically determined using the frequency of the oscillation. All right, so let's talk about our Bode plots. And so, and because I'm going to be talking a lot about Bode plots throughout this whole brief. So, so the first thing is that the Bode plot describes the relationship of the output to the input, and does it as a function of frequency. So you can see the frequencies on the x-axis, and we see gain, which is effectively our amplitude ratio. But I threw a curveball at you now. I'm putting it in decibels rather than just a straight amplitude ratio. And so kind of the easy thing to remember is typically you like to see a 1-to-1 relationship between your input and your output. And so if you have a 1-to-1 relationship, then you say there, the calculation comes out that it's 0 decibels. A lot of times you may have heard decibels when you talk about noise, the volume of noise, or volume in general. But 0 decibels means that it's a 1-to-1 relationship. 6 decibels means it's a 2-to-1 relationship. So output is 2 times as large as the input. And then minus 6 decibels is where the output is half the amplitude of the input. So there's the kind of key ones to kind of remember there. The other thing we want to remember is when we look at our Bode plot here and the gain that we see, this is kind of represents here, I'm representing what we call a second order system, kind of a very simple system, spring mass dampers. Many engineers maybe remember that. And so we can have a well damped response where you can see this lower curve. But if you start to see this peak here, then you know it's more of a lightly damped mode. There's kind of some sort of lightly damped mode in there. And so that's important because we're going to talk a lot about that when we go through the brief. The other thing is we look at the phase. And so you can notice that the phase kind of goes negative as you get higher in frequency, and essentially it indicates that the response is lagging behind the input. So, all right, so we got that out of the way. So kind of like I talked about before last year was, why is tuning so, why is tuning so difficult for helicopters, right? The big thing is that we've got these lightly damped rotor modes that really cause a lot of issues when trying to tune those rate P and rate D gains. You really can't bring those gains up very high before you start seeing this instability, basically this oscillation, uncontrolled oscillation of the vehicle. And so you can see in the pitch response here, in the dotted line, in the roll response, in the solid line, that you have these little bumps here. Basically, these are these lightly damped modes where here's the roll regressive or the roll, the flap regressive affecting the roll axis and the flap regressive affecting the pitch axis here. And then there's a coupling that you can see here between the pitch and roll that you can see in the roll axis. So, so it means we just can't get the rate P high enough for good control of the vehicle. And so we're using feed forward gain as well to do that. And most of our disturbance rejection is done through this angle P. So the next question is, well, what defines a good tune? We say that, hey, our actual attitudes match closely with our desired attitudes. That means that, we got a 1-to-1 relationship, right, between the output and the input. We have good disturbance rejection. So if we get hit by a gust, it's not going to pull us off of our desired attitude very much. And then this little to no overshoot means that, hey, if I make this input, am I going to see the rotor or the response oscillate right afterwards? Right? I pull up to 5 degrees nose up. Do I see this oscillation, or does it just go up and hit 5 degrees and stay there? And that kind of speaks to the damping in the aircraft. If it's more lightly damped, you'll see more oscillations. And then lastly, hey, that the actual response remains in phase with the desired. So you don't want to see that the aircraft gets too far behind your inputs or the autopilot's inputs, because then it's difficult to control that. So what does that look like on this Bode plot? Well, it looks like we got, basically it says that we want to keep the gain at 0 dB or 1-to-1 relationship. And we're going to try to get that as high as possible in the frequency before it kind of starts dropping off and we start seeing less output for a given input. And then the other thing is we want that phase, we want the aircraft to stay in phase with our inputs for as long as possible in frequency before it starts lagging behind the input. And so that's the desire that we want. And so that's kind of, well, now how do you develop an auto tune that's going to do that? So here's the tuning approach. Last year, I really hadn't worked it out fully. And so over the past year, obviously I was able to nail it down, and that was with the help of having those better rotor models to help me work through it. And really it kind of pared down to effectively what Leonard does in the time domain with the multi-rotor auto tune. They obviously don't have a feed forward component, but I'm doing some of the same things, except I'm just doing it in the frequency domain. So here's the kind of the setup of how we go through the tuning. We start with the feed forward gain tuning, basically looking at constant rate. And then we go through and determine the max allowable gains for rate P and rate D by closing the loop analytically. And we'll talk about that in a second here. And that's a frequency domain test. Next, the rate D gain is tuned, and then the rate P gain is tuned. And I'll go into more detail on that. It's also in the frequency domain. And lastly, we do the angle P tuning, which is done in frequency domain. And we'll describe more about how they're done a little differently between the rate tuning and the angle tuning. All right, so off to the left, you'll see kind of the maneuver that's being conducted here for the feed forward tuning. It'll just repeat. Hopefully you're able to see that fairly clearly online. So it's a single oscillation, 15 degrees nose down to 15 degrees nose up. And as it's going from nose down to nose up, you're looking to achieve some steady state rate. And this is, I'm just talking about the pitch axis here, but this is true for both the roll and yaw axes as well. So you can see pitch and roll, or the pitch attitudes, desired and actual are given here in yellow and blue. And then you have the rates are given here in the, I guess, green and red. And so you can see the red coming up and achieving some steady state. The green is the actual, and it's following that. And so what it does is it looks to see that what is the commanded output initially, and then it looks to see what the actual rate is that it achieved, and then it does an initial calculation. It starts to then iterate after it does the initial calculation to make sure it's matched within a certain percentage, and then it does the other direction, and that is averaged. And that's how the feed forward tuning is conducted. Okay, so here's the max, finding the maximum gain. And I thought, let's see here. Hold on 1 second. There we go. So you can see on the side here, the aircraft is oscillating in the pitch axis, and we have maneuvers that are done during the maximum gain. One is a frequency sweep or a chirp. We basically oscillate the aircraft at increasing frequency for like 23 seconds. I go from a low to a high frequency. Basically, it's the min to the max frequencies that are defined in the auto tune variables. And then we have a dwell that basically aircraft oscillates at a constant frequency. So those are the two maneuvers that are done. Now, what it does in the background is while it's doing the oscillation from min to max frequency, it actually will go and determine real time the peaks, determine what the gain is for the input and the output, and it determines what the phase between those peaks are. It does that real time, and you can see the data in orange is for that frequency sweep.
Hey, Bill, just wanted to say, sometimes we're losing your audio. I'm not quite sure if it's a microphone issue.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better?
It's normally fine. It's just like every now and then it cuts out for 3 or 4 seconds.
Okay, I'll see if I can speak up. Maybe it's losing me when I'm not speaking as loud.
Yeah, it doesn't cut out totally. It just gets really, really quiet and then it comes back. Anyway.
Okay, I'll see. Sorry, I'll try to speak louder then. All right, so the orange dots here basically show as it's doing the actual frequency sweep, what the phase it's calculating at real time. And then the blue dots are basically what's happening with the dwells. So it goes back and does the dwells, because I'm not quite sure. As you can see, it actually shows a fairly good agreement between the dwells and the sweeps here. But it goes back just to kind of identify the gain and phase at the specific frequencies it's looking for. It's actually looking here for the roughly 160 degrees phase, and then here it's looking for about 250 degrees phase and what the gain is at those frequencies for that phase. and then it's able to do this calculation. Essentially what we're doing is we're closing the loop analytically, and we can then, from closing the loop analytically, using the gain data from the dwells, we're able to determine what this max rate P and max rate D gains are going to be. All right, so now we can do the rate P and rate D tuning, and it starts off with the rate D tuning, and it does this, again, this frequency sweep, where it's actually now looking at the input desired attitude compared to the, desired rate compared to the actual rate. First, it uses that sweep to determine, hey, where's that 160-degree frequency where you get 160 degrees of phase, and then it starts looking at dwells and essentially increasing the rate D gain until it sees the response gain, which is the gain of that response. It'll start seeing it decrease, and it's going to look to increase that D gain value, the rate D gain value, until it decreases no more. After it starts to increase, and it stops the rate D tuning and starts the rate P tuning. And in that case, it now then does dwells and basically increases the rate P gain until it achieves this auto tune gain max parameter. And once it exceeds that, then it stops the tuning for the rate P and rate D. Angle P is done very similarly to the rate P and rate D tuning. We don't go and determine what the max allowable gain is. I kind of set limits to the angle P value, basically no lower than 3 and no greater than 10. And then it looks for the maximum response gain and what that frequency is. And then it'll go and increase the angle P gain or decrease it till it achieves the that gain max parameter. Essentially, it kind of tunes it to achieve what, so that the response output is meets that gain max parameter that's given in the auto tune as one of the auto tune parameters. Any questions on that? So that's effectively the auto tune and how it's done for helicopters. All right, so that went out in 4.2. It's in 4.2 beta, and after getting it merged into master, and I've already started coming up with some improvements. One that I was doing over the fall, kind of looking at, can we use closed loop predictions to kind of speed up that tuning process, right? Can I close that loop analytically, and maybe that will help me jump to the solution sooner. The reason the closed loop solutions are a little bit difficult, and the reason why they're not accurate or exact is because they're based off of a linear system. And obviously this is a real helicopter, so not necessarily a linear system. So we have delays in there and other things that we don't account for. It would be a lot more difficult to kind of do a real-time calculation of that. So I'm thinking that the closed loop prediction could provide a way just to jump to the answer sooner rather than just doing these incremental increases and kind of then arriving at a solution. I want to look at improving the angle P tuning. I'm not convinced the way I've got it now, where I'm just incrementing or decreasing the angle P till I achieve some response gain is the best way. I think this idea of like looking at the disturbance rejection, right? And this is I'll talk a little bit about this more in the next slide. And the last one is, something that I kind of fell upon when I was doing some research, looking at basically helicopter and how well it can. Okay. Anyways, I was working on some research, and basically what happened was we were trying to artificially change the bandwidth of the control of the helicopter. And I found that being able to match the input time constant and then kind of matching that to this target filter actually helped provide a much nicer response to the helicopter. And I'll explain more about that in a second. So talking about this disturbance rejection bandwidth. So this is an idea, or it's actually being used in industry and in government here in the US. It's taken from the handling quality specification for manned helicopters called the ADS 33. They're up to version Echo, E is an Echo. And so in the test guide for this specification, they go through this criteria. It's like an alternate criteria to look at disturbance rejection, how to quantify disturbance rejection, and say that for at least manned helicopters, piloted helicopters, that that the aircraft demonstrates good disturbance rejection qualities. And so they do have a value associated with this, and you can even scale it if you'd like to, but that's really not what I was actually after. I think what I'm more after is the fact that I can actually use it and what we call this disturbance rejection peak, and kind of increase the angle P gain until that disturbance rejection peak gets to a certain level, and then say, okay, we're going to stop it there. And so that kind of should maximize as much disturbance rejection characteristics as you can get out of the system without getting too much of that oscillatory behavior when it gets hit by a gust. And so down below here, you can see this is, you basically do a frequency sweep like you do before, but now you're looking at, to do this frequency sweep, you're actually injecting attitude disturbance into the system. And the way we do this in Arducopter is we basically can essentially turn off the feed forward, disable the feed forward paths, and basically just use that recovery roll, recovery pitch type test, this frequency sweep test, SysID mode. And in this case, you then look at the input and the output, where the disturbance attitude is the input and the actual attitude is the output. And so then you can then come up with this graph, which I would do essentially piecemeal with the dwells and find that peak. And then I could just increase the angle P until that peak. Maybe I'll just limit to 5 dB, maybe I'd limit to 3 dB, something certainly no more than 5. So that when the aircraft gets hit with a gust, you don't see it kind of oscillate too much when it as it tries to recover from that gust. And then the other improvement that I was talking about was in doing this and trying to artificially reduce the bandwidth of the control. We found that that you could use this target filter. What I think it's doing is it's limiting the error corrections, the attitude corrections that are fed into the rate controller. The attitude error corrections are fed into the rate controller, and those aren't really limited. The feed forward path has a nice, has that nice square root controller that gives a nice shape to it and somewhat limits what's being fed into the and as the rates into the rate controller, whereas the attitude correction not as much. And so I think this target filter, essentially setting it so that it's within the bandwidth of the actual rate controller, is helping to limit the peak. As you can see here, I showed 3 different plots here. One is, here's the target pitch to attitude target to the pitch attitude without the filter, right? That's this guy here. And then once we add the filter, you get the dotted line here where it reduces that peak, kind of limits what's being fed into the rate controller. And then finally, if you wanted to look at like what the pilot input was, and you looked at that compared to the response of the aircraft with the filter, you see you get this nice, what we're kind of looking at, what we wanted, which was this nice, hey, go to 0 dB as far out as you can, and then kind of fall off after that. Rate response, or the phase doesn't follow as much, but it does fairly well. We normally say that 135 degrees is essentially the phase that kind of marks what the limit of how fast and frequency you can move the stick and still have the aircraft keep up with you and give you a reasonable response that you can work with. So that I think where it really shines and really shows its merit is in the roll response. And so you can see here where we have these large peaks here, 6 and almost 10 dB peaks out here at these higher frequencies. Adding that filter in there helps get rid of those peaks, and you just have basically a 3 dB peak there, which is about a 1.4 overshoot that you'd see output to input, and really nicely manages that response. And then you can see the pilot, actually, when you were to make the stick input to the roll attitude, that's what you would see as far as your response. I've flown these, and it really feels, the aircraft feels a lot more, I'll say controllable, but the response is much nicer, and you don't see the oscillations in the background that you might see if you kind of tuned, if you didn't have this filter in there. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to my current project. And like I said, yeah.
Just one question on that last diagram there. I didn't quite understand. What's the pilot input to roll attitude with filter? That's not like what a pilot would do in the same situation, right? That's the actual, sorry, can you just explain what that pilot input part is?
Okay, yeah, certainly. So that's what's fed from the grader code to the attitude controller, right? It's the pilot's input. And then the attitude controller takes it and turns it into a target using the shaping. Does that make sense?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, and same idea is the position controller requests an attitude, and that attitude sent to the attitude controller, and the attitude controller then shapes it and comes up with the target attitude that it then basically forces the aircraft, or tries to force the aircraft to adhere to. So some of the current projects I've got is this rate shaping that I'm kind of looking into, as well as this autonomous auto rotation, which is not mine. That's Matt Keir and Ferruccio Vicari in Italy, who are they're both kind of working on it. So just going to go over what's going on with those two projects. So this past, I guess maybe earlier in this year, started looking at this idea of rate shaping because it makes sense that if we can specify the response we want in similar terms to how we're going to limit the bandwidth of the vehicle response, that you could makes it a little easier to then match those up and be able to then provide easier tuning way to tune the aircraft. And the rate shaping is really just talking about the axes that are rate command axes, like yaw in pretty much every mode, and then pitch and roll and acro, right? This would be this rate shaping that would be happening. Right now, the rate shaping is basically, it's discontinuous in a sense that, you put in your rate command and the controller shapes it by basically just, ramping it at the max acceleration parameter that's in your code, or that's in you have specified, up to the rate that you've specified. So it's very, like shown here, it's very, very discontinuous. And most of the time your aircraft doesn't respond like that. And so the idea is to use the square root controller to basically give it a nicer shape like it does with the attitude response. So you can specify some time to steady state. And so the square root controller would give a nice first order response and get to steady state in a nice fashion. And so what does that mean from a standpoint? We can actually now, at least on the rate side of things, my time constant directly can be directly associated with what the bandwidth that I want to set for my filter. So 1 over the time constant for a first order system essentially describes kind of that break point in your Bode plot, like where it starts to come down in the gain plot. And so that you can basically, it would make it a little easier to say, hey, if I put a time constant for my rate of, say 0.05 seconds, that would relate to 1 over that is 20 radians per second. And that would basically be the break point of where my response would start to be what we consider the bandwidth of the response. And so I could set up my filters to limit, or I could set up that response, I guess, to be within the bandwidth capability of the aircraft. And that would be an easy thing for the auto tune to then kind of grasp on and be able to set to make sure that the controller isn't asking more of the aircraft than it can provide. And so that should help with tuning, I think, a lot better.
Sorry, it's Randy again. Sorry, there's
Yeah.
a little chat going on there, between me and Leonard, and you're mentioning using the square root controller, and I was wondering, I mean, that's something different than that stuff that Leonard added for the S curves. The control, there's like a control file, and you can give it like a maximum acceleration and a jerk and stuff, and just give it like a position target, and it'll ramp the, it'll move the position of that target to that. It'll move
kinematically, kinematically using jerk and acceleration. Yeah, no, that, I mean, go ahead.
No, sorry, that's a different thing, right? It's a different method, I guess, than using the square root controller.
It is, and I think Leonard and I have talked. I mean, I think he was kind of saying that he had some thoughts of maybe moving that kind of control shaping into the attitude control, rate control at some point. But I think this is a good first step to use the attitude controller, since it's already in there. It would be easy to implement, and it certainly provides the right type of response that I'm looking for. This first order to get to steady state. That's kind of what you mostly see when you're looking at controllers and shaping the control.
So the real-time S-curve response is actually very closely related to the square root controller. The added complexity of the real-time S-curve response is that you get a time domain, a time constant response on the departure from your steady state when you input the command, as well as the approach to your target. So you get it curved on both sides. But the counter to that is there's a significant, it's a higher order system. There's additional complexity there, and you always want to start with the simplest possible implementation when you're doing this, because it's the easiest to model. You don't want to move to the more complex solution until you've developed a solid understanding of what you require, or you can very quickly get lost in the details. So yeah, so what Bill's doing here is exactly what you want to do as the first step. And then you evaluate if you can justify the additional complexity with some additional performance.
Yeah, I think this the square root controller is a good. I think that's going to be the final answer. I think it'll be good enough for what we're trying to do. And again, like I said, it's something that I can relate back to frequency domain and tuning, and be able to look at what is the bandwidth, what's the capability of the controller, because we've always said, hey, we got to keep the control algorithms within the capability of what the aircraft can produce. And that's we can tell that through in the frequency domain, and then be able to then set the shaping to then be within those constraints. And that's the idea.
Cool.
All right. So autonomous auto rotation, not a whole lot on this other than kind of a little bit of an update. I think most folks know that the initial development of autonomous auto rotation was done by Matt Keir through the GSOC program. He did a great job at laying out the framework for that auto rotation mode. And then he had completed the entry and glide phases during that development. And it's currently, it's not bit rotting. It's basically in CIDL and available to be used in CIDL for now. But I've got recent work. Matt says he has been working on it, but he's kind of going to turn his sights on it this year. But Ferruccio has been another user that's really been working on this, and he's actually come up with a solution that he's pretty much ready to go to flight test with. He's been working on it a lot within in CIDL, and he says he really wants to get it out in an actual helicopter and start using it. And it does require, which makes sense, having some sort of a LiDAR range for ranging the ground. So it provides much better information for judging closure rates and being able to do the flare and touchdown. So yeah, I'm excited to work with Ferruccio and even Matt. If Matt's got something going on, we can work together and try to hopefully get something like that into the code before our next conference next year. All right, so what do we got planned over the next year? Of course, I want to get those, look at the improvements to the auto tune and get some in if they deem worthy. Like I said, the autonomous auto rotation, if we can get that in there, and then clean up, continue to clean up the. I know with the ink, with throwing auto tune in there, I basically ate up a lot of flash space that Trad Heli held in reserve for a long time, but now I'm leading the pack with in front of Copter with how much flash space that our code is using. So yeah, thanks. So anyway, looking to clean up things there. So that's all I have. Any other questions?
You've gone very quiet at the end there.
Yeah, I was just saying, any
Bill?
other questions? Yeah, any questions?
I have yet another kind of basic question.
Sure.
Excuse my ignorance, but I guess the way that the autotune works then for Trad Heli is quite different than multicopters, right? Because multicopters do this twitch, but if I understand the presentation properly, I guess Helis don't do a twitch, at least for some parts, right? They do this constant kind of oscillation instead, right? And they just, the sweep, I guess is what you're calling it, right?
Yeah, sweeps and dwells, and it's more frequency domain based. Whereas Leonard, when he does in multicopters, when you're doing the twitch, they're kind of looking for the same thing. It's basically a step input, and they're looking for this kind of the same idea of what you would see in the response. If you see some overshoot, that overshoot describes this lightly damped mode, which I am looking at in the frequency domain through doing the oscillations.
Just people might not quite sort of, if you haven't sort of got a engineering background in this, so you can represent systems in a time domain where you have a step input or a change of input, and then you examine the output and how it oscillates and moves around. The other way you can represent and analyze exactly the same system is in a frequency domain where you apply a number of different constant frequency signals, and you analyze the response to each of those constant frequency components. And so both are related and interchangeable, and there's maths that will take you from one to another and back again. And which you choose depends on what you're trying to do and the types of signals you're trying to analyze and the maths that you've got available to you. So yeah, so don't think of them as two different things. Think of them as different ways of looking at exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So that's it for Trad Heli.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Absolutely fantastic. Great to see the continued evolution of Heli and just how much has improved over the last year.